Hello, and thank you for joining me today for the latest Global Mapper webcast. My name is David McKittrick, Senior Application Specialist here at Blue Marble Geographics. And today's topic, as you can see on the screen, is getting started with Global Mapper. Now, this presentation is intended for new users or prospective users, those who may be interested in seeing some of the basic functionality of the application. We're going to take several steps back from what we usually present, and we're going to introduce a very basic functionality, navigating the interface, adding some data, perhaps even exporting some data at the end of our presentation. So it's very basic information. Now, in the abstract or in the description for this session, we did make it clear that before you embark on any more substantive or involved workflows in Global Mapper, it is essential that you understand the basics. So we thought we would spend today just going through, again, the basic functionality, the basic tools within the application. So our agenda is a very basic one. We're going to start by, I guess where most people would start with Global Mapper, talking about the download process. How do you get the software? It's easily and readily accessible on our website. You can download the application directly. We do require you to log in to give us a little bit of information, then you can immediately download the software. We'll take a look at our website and show you where you can access the software if you're a new user, or if you're an existing user, where you can download an updated version if a new build is available. We'll talk about the installation process, which takes no more than a minute or two. And probably most importantly, we'll talk about registration. If you're a new user, there are a couple of options for registering the software, whether you want to try the software for a short term or whether you've purchased a license, and we'll go through that process. We will then get into actually looking at the software and touching on some of the key layout components, navigating the user interface is how we describe this, where to find key functions, what certain dialog boxes, what functions they perform, how to access different tools within the software. So again, not going too deeply into some of the more advanced tools, getting to know the basic layout so you can start to work with your data. Obviously, for most applications of Global Mapper, the idea of getting data into the application is probably the most important workflow. So we'll talk about that. How do we access files? You'll note we've indicated importing and streaming data. We'll introduce our online data streaming service, how to access some of those remote data sets through web map services and the like. We will talk about the process of saving a workspace. Now, I think this is perhaps the most important component of today's presentation, understanding how Global Mapper manages files. So when you finish a particular task, or you've imported some data and performed some analysis on that data, how do you save that? Or what's the process of retaining that information for maybe a future session, for maybe you're going home at the end of the day, you want to come back in the next morning and pick up where you left off. So we'll talk about how Global Mapper manages data and how you can save that. We call that file a workspace file. We will introduce very quickly our digitizing or drawing functionality. It's one of the most important applications, or one of the important components of Global Mapper, the idea to both create and edit vector features. And we could spend the entire session, in fact we could spend multiple sessions talking about the variety of digitizing functions. But again, in the interest of our limited time today, we'll just go through the basics and introduce some of those digitizing tools. Finally, and again, time permitting, we'll talk a little bit about getting data out of the application. Probably as important as the ability to import data is exporting data. And we know a lot of folks using Global Mapper, that is pretty much what defines their workflow. I have certain file formats, I need to convert them, I need to reproject them, I need to tile them, I need to mosaic them. So importing and exporting form the bookends of the procedures that you will follow within the application. So let's begin with the first bullet there, downloading and installing and registering Global Mapper. I'm going to begin this by actually bringing up the Blue Marble Geographics website. If you haven't been there already, bluemarblegeo.com, you can see the URL right at the top. And you can see you're looking at our homepage right now. And those of you who haven't visited our web page for a while, maybe some of you have used Global Mapper for a while, you'll see it's completely redesigned now. We've redesigned the graphics. We've even redesigned our logo. So new, we call it a fresh look for the website. Where we're going to go specifically, just while we're visiting, is to the download menu. And you'll see we have an option right at the top here to download Global Mapper. So if you're a new user, you want to get started with the application, you simply click this link. The page that comes up will give you various options for downloading. You'll see the first option, very clear, big blue button here, you can't miss it, is to download the 64-bit version of the software. And obviously this will depend on your hardware, whether to install the 64-bit or the 32-bit version of the software. Now, if in doubt, you can install both. You can actually have two running with the same license. You'll note the file size. It's about 112 meg for the 64-bit version, a little bit less for the 32-bit version. So the download does not take long, matter of under a minute to access the software. Those of you who are interested in some of the more advanced components, and I think specifically of the LiDAR module, but we deal with LiDAR, by the way, in a different series of presentations. So if you want to find out more about that, you can access some of our recorded webcasts or webinars. But that LiDAR module is actually included in this installation as well. There isn't a separate download. So this 112 megabyte file will include everything you need to operate the software and any additional components within the software. While we're on this page, it's worthwhile scrolling down just a little bit, because you'll notice we also have a number of alternative language versions. Obviously, this presentation today is in English, but if you happen to be a French speaker, Italian, Japanese, we have versions of the software in multiple languages you can access from the same page. And indeed, if you need the MSI files for the installer, you can download those as well. We do also, for those of you who are still on an older version, and maybe you need to reinstall your version 17.2, we do provide those installation files as well. So after downloading the software, the installation takes, as I said, little more than a minute or two, and when you finish installing, you can launch the software. Now, I've kind of bypassed one of the dialog boxes that you would encounter normally, just to show you, as an initial view, show you the layout of the software. If you had tried to install the software, you would have been prompted to register. Now, I'm going to get to that screen in just a little minute, but you can see I've been able to bypass that, and I have an unregistered version of the software on my screen, and that is confirmed right here in my toolbar, where it says quite clearly that it's unregistered, and the clue is also over here where it's indicating you can now buy the software if you want to purchase a license. This link, if I followed it, would take you back to the Blue Marble Geographics website. In that case, it would be to the purchase page, where you would have the option to place your order. We provide you with an order number, and you could activate the software. Now, that registration dialog box, again, it will appear by default when you try to launch the software for the first time. If you bypass it, such as I did, you can get there from the help menu. I'm going to spend a little more time a little bit later talking about some of these help options that are available in the software. But where I want to go now is straight to the Register Global Mapper item, about halfway down the list. This is our standard registration dialog box. You will encounter this when you, as I said, launch the software for the first time. And there are a number of ways, as you can see, that you can license or activate the software. The most common is what's selected by default here towards the bottom, is to enter a purchase number. This is going to be a node locked license. In other words, when I activate it on this machine, it is locked to this machine, so you can use it. It will obviously remember the registration and the licensing process. Every time you launch it, you'll be registered on this machine, so it is locked. And the way that we do that is basically by the insertion of an order number. That would be essentially what you purchase. It will unlock the software, and it's yours perpetually, and it's yours for good. If you're working for a larger company and you've opted to go with a network license, this is certainly an option. If you're working with multiple seats or potentially multiple users, we may encourage you to take a look at a network license as opposed to an individual license. In fact, it's a much more efficient way to deploy the software to multiple users, on the assumption that perhaps all of those users are not intending to use the software concurrently. This gives you the flexibility to have individual users access a license when they need it. Another option here is to activate the software through a physical file. Now, that's what we're going to do today. Just in the interest of convenience, I actually have created a .lic file that we're going to use to license our version of the software. This may be an option that you may want to pursue if you work offline and you do not have access to connect to our license server. We may send you a license file that will allow you to remotely activate the software. And the final option here, very important one for those of you who are trying the application for the first time, is to request a 2-week trial. The only limitation that this trial involves is the volume of data that can be exported. You will run into a wall as far as data export volume is concerned, number of files and size of files as well. So you can use the entire functionality of the software, but there is a limit in terms of the amount of data you can get out. So again, in my case, I'm going to choose the option to use a license file, a .lic file, and all I need to do at this stage is register me. It will prompt me to browse, and I have the license file I've generated right here, .lic file. I'll click open, and it gives me a little bleep in my ear here and a little happy message that I have now registered the software. And additional information if I do want to register the modules. I'll show you where that would take place in just a few minutes. We click OK to finalize that. The buy now message is gone, and confirming I now have a registered version of Global Mapper. The build date, you'll notice here is noted. People often wonder what this series of numbers is. Well, this basically, the B stands for build. 11 is the 11th month, that's being November. The 29 is the 29th day of November in 2016. So reading this information, I can confirm that the version of the software that I'm currently using was built on the 29th of November this year. So it's a few days old now. I'm sitting here, it's now, it's December 1st. It's just turned December. So it's a couple of days old. We can also get information about the build from the help menu. All the way at the bottom, About Global Mapper gives you information about the software, including not only the build date, but also the time. This particular build was released at 1:30 it looks like 1:30 in the morning, 01:30 on November 29th. The build of Global Mapper is in a constant state of development. We release formal builds. If I go back to our website once again, the formal release build right now, if you go to our download site, is the 16th. And obviously mine is a little bit newer than that. And the reason for that is because we're constantly rebuilding the application to address specific needs. You may have a situation where you contact our tech support folks and we have some issues that we need to maybe straighten up in the software, maybe you need to add additional tools, and if that's the case, you may be given access to those what we call daily builds. Those are released on demand. On a recurring basis, those are formally placed on our website and can be downloaded by everyone. Now, one of the things I mentioned just a few minutes ago was the idea of enabling modules within Global Mapper. If you are using LiDAR data, we do have a LiDAR module that provides advanced LiDAR processing capability, things like vector extraction, automatic ground detection, things like that. A very, very powerful set of tools. It is an additional purchase over and above the purchase of the application itself. And as I mentioned, when you download the software, you will actually get the actual module embedded in the install files. To activate it, you're going to go to the help menu and you're going to go to the module module extension license manager dialog box. You'll see LiDAR noted here. That's by far the most common use of this dialog box. I'm not going to go any further with that today, but you just simply check that box. If you do, it will prompt you once again with the registration dialog box, and if you have an appropriate order number for the LiDAR module, that will then activate the LiDAR module. Again, more information on that module is available through some of our other webcasts or recorded presentations. Also, on my notes here, I always make sure that we cover the additional help that's available. Obviously, what we're doing today is introducing new users to the basics of the software, but there are other avenues you can follow to get help with your getting up and running with the software. And from the help menu, obviously, we have a number of options here. The basic help files, I'm going to drag these in from off screen, are searchable, indexed, organized, and categorized instructions and descriptions of every feature and function in the software. So if you want to search, for instance, for something like watershed, if you're interested in watershed analysis, conduct your search, show me a list of the topics, and it will show you everything that has that name. So if I wanted to create a watershed, simply click on the link. It will give me all the instructions for watershed creation. This is ground zero as far as help is concerned. Everything and anything you need to do in the software is documented here very, very extensively and very thoroughly. That's stop number one. Also, and in a sense mirroring what we're doing today, we also have a getting started guide. This is a more concise, perhaps abbreviated intro to the software, and indeed many of the things that we're going to cover today will mirror what you'll see in this Getting Started guide. It is a PDF that we've actually linked from our website. I could download this locally if I needed to, or I could print it if necessary. And if I scroll quickly through, you'll see it's got the basic topics, again, many of which we're going to be covering today. Installation, registration, navigating the interface, exactly the sequence of topics we're going to be covering in this presentation. And then we get into more specific topics like preferences, using some of the file management tools, etc., etc. I'm not going to go any further, but again, it's another resource that's available, intended almost entirely for new users. Also from the help menu, we provide a direct link to our forum. Now, the Global Mapper Forum is a very active community of users representing a wide variety of skill and proficiency levels, and indeed a wide variety of industries and businesses. I encourage you strongly, if you're interested in finding out more about Global Mapper, especially in how it's applied in some of those more specific situations, to take some time to either post your questions on the forum or just simply to browse through some of those topics. You'll notice after selecting that confirmation that the build that I have installed has been copied to the clipboard, which is very useful, because if I'm having a problem or want a question answered, I can simply paste that into the body of the message, and it will immediately tell the readers of that question a little bit about what version of the software I'm using. I'll click OK. It'll once again bring up my browser and show the Global Mapper forum and some of the topics that have been asked about in here. Again, very, very active community. Strongly encourage you becoming involved in the forum. A couple of other options here. Again, how do we find help? Well, we've got a frequently asked questions list. We have access to some of our other webinars. Obviously, this recording will be part of that, and we'll have this posted in a few days of finishing this recording, and that will be available along with all of the others. We have found a lot of people get a lot of value in going back to some of even our older webinars, touching on some of the components in there. Most of those are instructional. They'll provide information about how to perform certain functions, and we will continue to generate these and update them based on new functionality in the software. So in the next section, we're going to take a look at the interface itself. We're going to go through some of the highlights or some of the main components of the user interface and introduce things like some of the toolbars, perhaps a configuration dialog box where you can establish certain settings. For instance, if you want to establish a particular unit of measure as the default. So we'll start with, again, a high level, introducing the basic layout of the software. Now, if you've never seen Global Mapper before, I mean, the most obvious component of the interface is the text and the buttons right in the middle of the screen. These are actually links now. They used to be in the form of buttons, but they perform the same function. So obviously, our software name. If I challenged any user to figure out how to open a file in Global Mapper, chances are if you can read this link, you can perform that function. Very easy to get data into Global Mapper. Very often I define that process of opening a huge front door and allowing all of the files to come in. Global Mapper simplifies the process of accessing data. We're going to actually do this in our next section where we'll actually open some data, but it is not a challenging process. We also provide links right here in the intro screen to some of the online sources. So if you need to stream some data, if you want to access some imagery or some terrain data from an online service, this is again an option for you to access one of those streaming services. By the way, this is not the only way to perform this function. We have buttons and options in the toolbar that will perform the same process. But again, to simplify the initial experience for the new user, we make these very prominent on this introductory screen. Before you even begin to use the software, you can access some of the configuration options. We'll be doing this in a few minutes, where we'll visit some of the key settings that can be applied. But again, as an intro into the application, we provide that link. And finally, we give you the option to load some default data. This is something that was added fairly recently into the application, the idea of actually providing some map information. And this simply provides a link to a file that's embedded in my folder structure and is installed with the application. As you can see, it's a world map. So it gives you something to look at if you're starting with a software. We now actually have a map in place. And while this is not really intended to perform any meaningful workflow, it is a good reference. I often will find myself loading this map just simply to see where some data resides. If somebody sends me a file and I want to see where in the world it is, quite literally where in the world it is, I can load this as a backdrop and then load in their data, and I can see exactly where that data resides. So it does have a certain function. I should also mention, by the way, and this is a little more advanced, something we deal with in some of our more advanced tips and tricks presentations, but you can actually customize this file. So it doesn't have to be a map of the world. It can be whatever map that you want. Back to our introduction, let's introduce some of the key components now that we have some map data in place. So let's start top left corner, I guess. The file menu primarily functions as a way to get data into the application and to get data out. We'll be doing this again. The next section we'll talk about loading files in, and at the end, hopefully, again, time permitting, we'll talk about exporting as well. Editing is primarily for copying and pasting. View allows us to change the perspective. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but you can control things like the zooming process. You can change your toolbar layout. So anything that pertains to the visual appearance of the layout or the map view itself can be controlled here. Tools is where we've defined the basic function of the cursor along with a number of other options. Things like a coordinate converter is embedded in here. Some people forget or are not aware that this is in here, but a simple little tool for taking some X and Y values or latitude and longitude values and running conversion on them. So nice little application within an application. But the primary functions here to define what you want to do with your cursor. We'll be using some of these throughout today's presentation. Analysis is where the real powerful components of Global Mapper resides. This is where you can perform things like watershed analysis or perform a raster calculation or even generate some contours. Very common use of the software. So all of those more advanced tools you'll access right here in the analysis toolbar. The layer menu lets you manage your layers, as it implies. We have a search function, allows you to search for either an address, an external address. In other words, if I want to find a location based on a known address, we use a web service for that, or a component within or a feature within your loaded data. We have a GPS menu. Many of you are using this for remote work. If you plug in a standard GPS receiver, you can actually use Global Mapper in a remote situation. It will track your location. It will allow you to add waypoints. So we have a GPS menu to control many of those functions. And finally, as we introduced very briefly at the start, we have our help menu to get all the help that you need. So again, many different functions available as menus at the top of the screen, and then as a standard Windows layout we have these buttons, and the buttons are essentially shortcuts to what we would consider to be the most commonly used tools. I'm not going to be spending time on describing each of these, but they're divided into what we define as fairly logical categories. You'll notice they can be moved around. The little dividing bars, the little dots here indicate that this is a separate toolbar. I can move it around. I can even undock these toolbars if I want to drag it down into the interface itself, making it more convenient to interact with the map and my tools. I certainly have that option. So we've redesigned the interaction with toolbars with the latest release with version 18, so you can actually customize the toolbars themselves. We can remove buttons that we don't need. For instance, if I never find myself using the point tool, not sure that that's an accurate one, but if I wanted to turn it off, I simply uncheck it. It will disappear from the toolbar. It's not gone completely. I still have access to it, and I can turn it on as necessary. Also, you'll see an option that allows us to customize the toolbars. We can add additional functions to a toolbar, or we can change how the toolbar is displayed. This dialog box just appeared off screen. I'll drag it in, and you can see now a list of all of the functions for which a toolbar item can be added. So, for instance, if I wanted to take the Save Workspace function and add it perhaps to my Digitizer toolbar for whatever reason, I simply drag. I'm not going to do it right now, but I drag it and drop it at the position I want within my toolbar. Some of the other options we have for customizing the toolbars, we can show text labels. Now, the analysis menu is the one that's selected specifically. That's this group of tools right here. Now, some of you may not be familiar with some of these functions. You'll notice as I move my cursor, we give you a description, first of all, the name of the toolbar, and then a description as to the function that's performed by that particular button. If you want to simplify that, we can actually show labels. And again, it's for this selected toolbar. So you'll see now, it takes up a little more space, but now I can see the text that describes what that particular button does. I'm not sure you'd want to have that on permanently, but if you're getting started with the software and you want some instruction, you can certainly turn that on. So toolbars can be customized, can be undocked, can be moved around, and you can have those labels as necessary. If you're not intending to use all of these toolbars, for instance, if you never work with any 3D data, you may not need the 3D toolbar, you may not need some of those options. The toolbars themselves can be controlled under the View menu. You may have noticed when we were here a minute ago, there is a Toolbars menu item, and again we've got a list of all of the toolbars. You can check them or uncheck them as needed, and what's probably most useful is you also have the option to restore their positions. This is particularly useful if you find yourself changing your screen resolution, or perhaps just resizing the display or the window, the Global Mapper window. You can restore them to their default positions. It cleans up the layout very quickly and very easily. So while we have some map data on the screen, it's also worthwhile spending some time talking about how we interact with the map, some of the tools we have for moving around on the map. I happen to have a mouse as opposed to a trackpad, and I have a mouse wheel. Easiest way for me to zoom on the map is simply to use my mouse wheel. So if I position my cursor over India and I simply scroll in, using my mouse wheel, very easy to zoom on the map, as you can see. Zooming in, zooming out. My zoom tool is actually what has been selected now. So the function of my cursor as defined by the icon is in its zoom mode. That means if I simply left click, it will also zoom to the location of my cursor. I can right click to zoom out if necessary. So zooming in, zooming out can be done with either the mouse wheel, which I find personally most convenient, or simply by choosing the tool or making sure that tool is selected and left clicking or right clicking. This tool also allows me to drag a box around an area of interest to zoom in. So I'm clicking and holding with my left mouse button. When I release, Sri Lanka becomes my map display. And combination of using the mouse wheel, using the drag to select, allows you to move around the map very efficiently. Again, I'm using my mouse wheel to zoom out. Moving left and right, or panning, if you move your cursor to the edge of the screen, you'll notice the cursor actually changes to an arrow. And if I click at that stage, it will move my map in that, or move my view of the map in that direction. Now, some people find that to be a little intrusive, especially if you're doing digitizing, where you get to the edge of the map display and you want to continue to digitize. Well, Global Mapper will essentially hijack whatever tool is currently active and turn it into this panning tool. If that's an issue for you, you can actually disable this function. That's one of the options in the configuration dialog box that we'll take a look at in just a few minutes, where you can disable that panning tool, that panning option. Final thing to talk about as far as moving around on the map is concerned is, again, back to the mouse wheel. It is fairly intuitive using the mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out, but the mouse wheel can also be clicked and held, and if that's the case, you'll notice it changes the cursor and once again allows me to pan. I find that one very useful. Simply click and hold the mouse wheel. I may be digitizing, I may be using some other function, but simply clicking and holding my mouse wheel will let me move around on the map without having to select a particular tool or without having to move my cursor to the edge of the screen to lose my context. So click and hold the mouse wheel, drag around, use the mouse wheel's scrolling function to zoom in and zoom out. That combination of functions makes interacting with a map display or interacting with a map view very, very simple and very intuitive. Another thing to show before we get into looking at some of the configuration options is a fairly new function in Global Mapper again for displaying multiple map views. Our multi-map view function is a button in the cursor, or sorry, a button in the toolbar where my cursor is located. If I select that option, again, dialog box popped off screen, I'll drag it into display here. I can add a second map view. Now in this case, I've only got one map layer loaded, so it's basically going to be a duplicated version of the same view. I can decide if it's going to be a 2D or 3D map. If I have some elevation data, for instance, I could bring up a second map that shows me the same view only in 3D, or if I'm working with a path profile, essentially a cross-sectional view of some terrain, I can have that as a second map view. So once I choose the map type, I can also choose where it's going to be displayed, at the right, bottom, left, or top of my current map view. I'll add mine to the right side, and I'll simply click Add, and you'll notice over here on the side I have a duplicated map in this case. I'm not sure how useful this is. I can independently zoom it, so if I want to zoom in and see a close-up view of the Iberian Peninsula here, I can see it while looking at my wider area on the original map, on my map on the left-hand side. If we did have additional data sets loaded, we could choose which layers to display in each view, which is probably a more useful function. The idea of customizing the map and having one display with one type of data while the other display is an alternative view of the same area. To close that map view, very simple, go back into the same dialog box, and you can either close a selected view or close all views. Now obviously I've only got two. You could have multiple views, by the way. I could have 3, 4 or as many views docked within the interface as I need. I could close them all at one time or just close a selected one. In my case, I'll just close all views, confirming that, and we're back to our original view again. Configuration dialog box is an important one, and sometimes I'll introduce this at the start of, for instance, a training class or presentation before you actually embark on any workflow or any work within Global Mapper, addressing the idea of some of the settings. In other situations, I'll wait. Let's take a look at some data. Let's take a look at how we interact with the data and then in the appropriate context, we can look at the configuration dialog box. But in any case, it's accessible from the toolbar here, where my cursor is right now. This is our configuration button. You will remember that it was one of the options in the intro screen as well. The configuration was a line item there that you could click on, again providing the option before you start working with any data to apply certain settings. In either case, it will load up this dialog box. Once again, this has changed with the recent build of Global Mapper, the version 18 build, where previously it was a series of tabs. Now we have this hierarchical tree view. So if we choose, for instance, general, it gives us a subset of different windows under the general theme or vector display. Again, a subset of themes under the vector display. Again, at the risk of spending too much time going through the minutiae of the options that are available here, I want to hit on some of the ones that most people would be interested in. Background color of the map is one. It is now white by default. Older versions of Global Mapper had a yellow background as a default. You can change it right here. You can set whatever color you want. Units of measure are an important one, and you'll see a subset here of my general tab provides me the option to determine my area units, volume units, distance units. Now we'll see very quickly the consequence of this. As you'll see, my setup is in metric, as reflected in this scale at the bottom of my screen here in kilometers. If I change this to our statute, feet and miles, and I'll simply click apply, it immediately changes that. So very simple. Now we're dealing exclusively in those statute measurements, feet and miles as the case in this situation. I'll go back to my original again, and again reflected in the scale bar. Some of the other options under display options. If you need to display a grid, this is often something that people are required actually to put a lat long grid or current projection grid on a map. This is how we do it right here. There's a grid option. Layout elements are also available here. Now this is a slightly different approach to adding some of these layout elements, again compared to some of the older versions of Global Mapper. I talked about my distance scale changing, but if we need to control some of the other elements of the scale, for instance the font, background color, where it's located on my screen, these options can be set here, as can a map legend, north arrow, elevation legend if you're working with some terrain data. Vector display, one of the common functions of the vector display is to filter what's displayed currently on your screen. I've obviously only got one layer on here, and it's a layer that contains polygons. I'll very quickly uncheck the rendering of areas or polygons, and as you would expect, it disappears. So that's a very simple but very effective way to clean up the map on a temporary basis. I should say, if you're using any of these filtering options, be aware of what you've done, because you could uncheck one of these and import a file containing areas. It will simply not display if this filter has been applied. We can also filter different types of areas. For instance, if you have polygons that are defined as buildings and you don't want to display those, you can filter everything that you don't need to display based on these feature types. Another important component of our configuration dialog box, perhaps even arguably the most important, is the projection tab, because this is essentially the function that determines the display projection of what's on the map. Regardless of the native projection assigned to any layer that I've imported, we can change that display projection right here. We can define the projection parameters, and ultimately what we set in here will also be inherited by any data that we export from this display. So if my workflow requires me to import a file in a particular projection and then ultimately export that file in a different projection, I will come to the configuration dialog box and to the projection setting, and I will establish the projection parameters here. So if your workflow requires reprojection, this is where you'll go to perform that function. Finally, here I want to take a quick look at area styles. We can also reference line styles and point styles as well, but I'll take a look specifically at area styles. If you're digitizing using the digitizer, as we will a little bit later, when you finish drawing something, you can assign that to a pre-configured feature type. For instance, it could be a city park, and you'll see that the city park will inherit a specific default display. You can change it if necessary, but it will inherit this display by default. And if it's appropriate, you can assign a pre-configured set of attributes for that feature. Now, this combination will simplify any data creation work that you do, because you can pre-populate an attribute table with the information that you know you need to add about these particular features. In this case, it's my city parks, so I don't have to do it manually. So we have a list of pre-configured area types. We also have the option, perhaps more importantly, of adding new types, essentially building your own library of feature types that you know you're going to be digitizing, and being able to populate each of those feature types with the appropriate attributes. Very, very powerful functionality, and very important for streamlined workflow if you're doing a lot of drawing or digitizing. Now, if you recall back to where I was a second ago under vector display, where I had the options to filter these, I could then remove what I don't need to see, retaining just the ones that I want to display for the digitizing work that I'm doing. So it simplifies this interface, simplifies your interaction with those vector features. Now, the final thing I want to talk about very quickly here are some of the keyboard shortcuts. The standard Windows shortcuts will work. Control-C for copy, Control-V for paste. If you want to copy and paste an object between layers, those shortcuts will work. The standard Control-O to open, Control-S to save. Again, those are standard Windows keyboard shortcuts. Within Global Mapper, there are some unique keyboard shortcuts. For instance, Control-U, my personal favorite. Control-U will essentially wipe the map clean. I'm going to do that one right now. Control-U. And essentially takes everything off the map. Because I hadn't made any changes, there was no saving required, so I just got back to the intro dialog box again. So keyboard shortcuts are a very common way for you to interact with map features. There is a option here in the help menu with a keyboard shortcut list. You can see that. I'm not going to access it right now, but if you want confirmation on some of those keyboard shortcuts, you can access this from the help menu. Also, one of the options in the toolbar is this drop-down list that gives you the option of setting up your own. So if you perform certain functions repeatedly or on a recurring basis within the application, you can assign those to a keyboard shortcut, especially those are maybe hidden deep in a dialog box or deep in a menu or submenu. You can't remember where that tool was. You don't have to. You can essentially define your entire workflow through a set of customized keyboard shortcuts. This list, by the way, will also record functions you have performed within the application, so you can easily access those as well. One of the things I was doing this morning was creating a grid. That tool is now listed here, and if I want to perform that again, I simply select that, click the button next to it, and it will initiate that tool automatically. So we know a lot of folks using Global Mapper, their entire interaction is derived from this frequently used list of functions, combined with perhaps some keyboard shortcuts included in there as well. Now, as I said at the start, this is probably the most simple and straightforward component of any workflow, getting data into the application. It's a very simple process. You can use multiple mechanisms to actually load a file. Simplest, perhaps, is just dragging and dropping the file into the interface. But as you'll see through the screenshot over here on the left side of my screen, we also have an option. If you're need that visual cue, we have an option here to open data files. And we're going to perform a few different processes to get data into the application. So our first experience with Global Mapper was loading default data, obviously with no control over the individual files, but it essentially loaded data. What we're going to do in this first very simple import process is use the button right here in the middle of the intro screen, open data files. Before I select one of these files to import, it is worth noting the array of data that can be added to Global Mapper. This is probably one of the most important defining characteristics of the application, is its ability to work with virtually any spatial data. As you can see, I'm scrolling down very slowly through this list here, and noting that it's basically got every possible spatial file format, all the common ones, and even some of the more obscure ones that, to be honest, I've probably never had a chance to look at, or will never have a need to look at. But a very, very extensive list of supported formats. Do not worry about understanding all of those. People sometimes get intimidated by the extent of that list, and how am I ever going to understand Global Mapper? It seems to be very complicated. You do not need to worry about that. The important thing for any user are the files that I'm intending to use supported, and chances are they're going to be, and that's more important. Notice the default setting here in the import dialog box says recent file types. You can change that to be commonly used formats, just elevation formats, or raster formats, or vector formats, or 3D model types. If you're using some STL or perhaps SketchUp formats, you can filter your list of files just to be those types. All the way at the bottom of the list is all files. So if you want to just basically navigate to a folder where you see all of the files, that's at the bottom of this. I'm not going to go there right now. In this case, I'm simply going to import some imagery just to show how simple the process is. This is a JP2. The projection parameters are embedded in the header center of this file. So when I click open, that's all I need to do. It will load the file up directly. In this case, it's a UTM projected file. You can see in my status bar along the bottom of the screen that's confirmed UTM zone 15 north in this case, NAT 83, and this is a cropped section of some imagery surrounding a town. We're going to be looking at some other data sets for this area. I'll just zoom in again using our zoom tools once again, selected by default, zooming in, and you can see the map will then obviously zoom in and give me detail that's appropriate for that level. I'll use another option to import a second file. This time it's going to be a vector file. We'll go to the file menu now, and again, option here to open data file, exactly the same function that we accessed in the intro screen. You'll also notice a clue here that we can also use the keyboard shortcut Control-O, or the icon in the menu correlates with the icon here in the toolbar. So any of these options will work, performs the same function. In this case, I'm importing a shapefile. And in this case, I'm not sure if you're seeing that, but it's a vector shapefile with some property outlines or parcel boundaries in this case. So 2 layers loaded. Now, what happened during that load process, by the way, with that second file, it was obviously, it lines up perfectly with the underlying imagery. That process, the reason that happens is because Global Mapper can reproject any file on the fly. In other words, even though the native projection for this parcel layer may be assigned to a different system, obviously, for display purposes, all of my layers now pertain to UTM zone 15. So reprojection on the fly simplifies that import process again. I wasn't prompted to define the projection. That was done automatically for me. Again, the interest here, keeping things as simple as possible. Now, this next workflow or next import, I'm actually going to drag a window from off screen, and we're going to drag and drop. This is perhaps the most simple process. I've got another vector file, got some roads here. Again, it's a shape file. Simply dragging and dropping that file on the map initiates the export. That's the simplest way to get data in. Perhaps you're seeing some linear features. The road center lines have been imported. The final layer I'll load up here, again, because I have the window open, I'll use the drag and drop method, is some elevation data. And this is an underlying or basically a terrain model for this area. So just an example of, in this case, 4 different files I was able to load up using a number of different mechanisms, from the standard file open, that introductory screen, and as I indicated, probably the simplest way is simply dragging and dropping. Now, while we have this data loaded, it is worth noting the management, or at least introducing the process of managing data. One of the layout elements, one of the interface elements that I consciously did not introduce during the introduction, was the overlay control center, and it's currently not being displayed. I can access that from a button right here in the toolbar, overlay control center. Also, you'll notice Alt-C is one of our keyboard shortcuts as well. So Alt-C is what I'm going to do right now, and it will open up a sidebar window that displays the layers that are currently loaded. It displays them in a particular order, and actually I have reversed the order here so that the last layer that I loaded is the one on top, and you'll notice now that that's actually sitting on top of the imagery. The vector layers are actually sitting on top of the elevation simply because of the structure of those layers. Logic being that any vector layers would likely sit on top of raster layers. You can change that, by the way. There are settings you can apply to change that. The hierarchy for older versions of Global Mapper was reversed, and where the list was actually the last layer that you load was on the bottom. You can change that right here, by the way. I simply right-clicked in the control center, and display list in reverse order is what I've selected. That's why I'm seeing my dem sitting right on top. Now, we know the imagery is still there. If I turn off the dem, just simply uncheck this box, we can see it's still there. What I want to do now is make the elevation model sit below the imagery. I can simply drag it, and I can drop it right below the imagery. And just confirming that, we'll say yes. And now we're seeing the imagery again. That's not to say the elevation model has been removed or is no longer applicable. It's still there, but it's now sitting underneath. And it performs the function of providing a terrain layer on which that imagery is sitting. So it gives me an opportunity to show you another interface component, and that's our 3D view. Right here in the toolbar, a major development focus in Global Mapper over recent releases has been working with 3D data, point cloud data, LiDAR data, elevation models, and performing analysis against those. So obviously visualizing this data in 3D is a very important component. I'm going to simply click the button. Again, it's off screen here. I'm going to bring it into view, and we now have a 3D view. Unfortunately, I've chosen somewhere in the Midwest, and we're seeing our vector layers come into display here, but it's not a lot of terrain here, unfortunately. It's a fairly flat area. I probably should have chosen an area with a little more terrain, but you can see now we have a 3D perspective with our imagery now sitting on top of that terrain model, of that elevation model. I think there's maybe a little bit of high ground over in the corner there. Bump up the exaggeration just a little bit. Now, if you're interested in seeing more detail about some of these 3D tools, there again there are video presentations in which we go into the various procedures in Global Mapper for working with 3D data, working with point cloud data, and working with terrain data. So again, we're not going to go into any more detail today, but it is a major part of the application. Back in the Overlay Control Center, again, the what I would consider to be the brains of the application, the nerve center, where you can control the layers, where you can control the order, also where you can define certain options that pertain to those layers. So for instance, if I take the parcels layer, I can right click and choose options for that layer. And this is a vector layer, so some of the options include how it will be displayed. Right now it's displayed based on its default classification, which is essentially black outlines. If I wanted to change that universally to be perhaps red outlines, I'm just going to simply change that color to red. And this is just one example of how we can alter the visual characteristics of a layer. And this we're doing for the layer as a whole, as opposed to for an individual feature, or indeed for to reflect any of the inherent data. So one of the options here is to apply styling based on an attribute. If that's appropriate, I could change the color of these to reflect perhaps the property value or the property size or whatever it is. So there is an extensive list of thematic mapping capabilities within the application. Also from the Overlay Control Center, we can access metadata about a layer. Just a summary basically of the contents of that layer, the bounding coordinates, the number of features. In this case there's 1,131 areas, and the number of vertices, actually the number of shape points. And again, bounding information, the coordinate information, coverage area is noted in here, as well as the load time. How much time did it take that layer to load? It took 0.16 seconds to load onto my system. So it's a very small layer, didn't take a lot of time. So the Overlay Control Center gives you access to a number of tools pertaining to the layers and allows you to manage those layers very efficiently. It is a docked component that's new in version 18. It can be undocked. I simply pick it up and drag it, and I can have it floating. If I was working with two monitors, I may want to drag this to a second monitor, or I can dock it on any additional side. You'll notice the little arrows indicating that if I simply release, it'll dock it on the right side instead of the left side. So I do have that option. So it can be docked or it can be floating, whichever is your preference. So a couple of other things I want to talk about in the context of loading data into Global Mapper. I'm going to turn off a few of these layers just to clarify the results of what I'm about to show you. Again, we've got our vector layers now displayed, we've got our roads, we've got our parcels, which I loaded and changed the color. If we need to access data remotely, if you remember in the introductory screen there was a button that provided access. To be honest, when you're working in a particular area, it's perhaps more useful to load some reference data before you initiate this process. That way I'm not loading the whole world or the extent of that data depending on what service you're accessing. So now that I've focused in on a particular area, I have the option to access from the button you see on the toolbar any of these online data services. This list, as you can see, is categorized by a couple of different ways. It's categorized by type, data type, also by geography. For instance, US data, we have a number of US data sets listed in here, but also we've got imagery, which also includes some of those US data sets as well. So I want to just quickly choose some imagery. I'll choose this NAPE imagery, and we'll click connect. Now what's going to happen by default is it's going to load just what's on my screen. I can opt to load the entire data if that's my preference, but in this case I don't need to. I'm just going to load the screen bounds. I'm very much at the whim of this service. I'm not sure how reliable this one is. If it doesn't succeed here in a second or two, we may abort this, and this is obviously the data. There we go. Displayed for me. So this is now a streamed data set. This is now data that's been served up from a remote location. In this case, I just grabbed some imagery. But it does depend on that continual web connection to display. If your workflow requires you to work in a disconnected environment, perhaps in the field, or you don't have continual access to the internet, my next workflow, my next series of steps would be to export this. And I could export this simply from the file menu, run an export, and it's a raster or image format file that I would generate. We'll formally introduce the export process a little bit later, but just by way of completing this introduction to some of these streaming services, getting data out of the application and putting it in a file that you can access locally on your hard drive makes access to that data much more efficient, and it doesn't obviously require you to be continually connected. Some of the other services I want to point out specifically here, obviously imagery is a very common use of these online services, web map services, but we also provide access to a very interesting data set of OpenStreetMap data. There actually are two variations on this. One is the standard raster, of which, by the way, we've introduced some different shading options in here. Haven't spent a lot of time looking at these. But the other option is to load OpenStreetMap in vector form. Now, in this case, what would happen, I'm not going to do it in this case, but what would happen is it would actually take the extent of my current display in Global Mapper and relay that to the OpenStreetMap website and allow me to download vector objects, essentially roads, streets, points of interest for the extent of my current map view in Global Mapper. Very, very useful and very interesting function. If you've got a copy of Global Mapper, I recommend you try this yourself. I'm not going to do it in the interest of time right now. And if you're not familiar with OpenStreetMap, this again will redirect you to the website. I do recommend you take a look at that. It's a very, very, very useful open source map data set you can access, again, in raster or in vector format. Now, the final workflow that we're going to do related to getting data into the application involves working with a very simple file, and I've actually dragged the Windows Explorer dialog box back into my screen. This is a text file, and you'll see it's simply latitude and longitude value separated by a comma. Here are a series of essentially point locations if you want to take it literally. What we'd like to do with this is import it as a layer into Global Mapper. Now, you may have access to data that's similarly formatted. Perhaps it's data you collected yourself using a GPS receiver. We're going to go through the process of transforming this series of points essentially into something that's useful as a geographic object. I don't want individual points in this case. What I want to do is actually convert these into areas, and it requires a different import process. From the file menu, there is an option to import ASCII text files, regardless of the structure, regardless of the suffix that's applied to them. You can use that menu item for that. You can also, as I did before, simply drag and drop, and that's what I'm going to do in this case. So I'll drag, drop my text file, and it brings up a unique dialog box that allows me to tell Global Mapper what exactly is contained within that file. Now, we're not dealing with a file that's inherently a geospatial file. It is, as I previewed, simply a text file. So we need to tell Global Mapper a few things about it. We want areas as opposed to points. We need to define the coordinate format, and if you remember back to the quick preview, my latitude value was first. We'll leave that as is. There's no fields to skip. It's a comma delimited file. We don't have any elevation data. You can also use this, by the way, to bring in XYZ or XYZ data. Don't have any elevation here, so we're going to uncheck that. Everything else should be fine. The intent here is to create a polygon. If I click OK, confirming the coordinate values that we saw, we know they're geographic lat long. If they were UTM or some other format, we could change this default. This should be fine for us. Finally, click OK one more time. And I don't know if you're seeing off to the side here, but we actually imported a boundary file. I'm going to turn off a few layers so we can see a little more clearly. But we were able to take the text file and essentially convert it. Oops, let me hit my home button. There we go. Convert it into a polygon in this case. So what were a series of line items in my text file are now vertices in a polygon. So just a different method for getting data into the application. Most of the processes of importing data are very simple. There are a few more advanced. One final thing to point out, if you're dealing with multiple files, there is also an option to import all files in a directory. So you don't have to do it individually. You don't have to select each one. It will prompt you to determine, based on a wildcard process, what the suffix is if you want a particular data type, and then it will look through a folder or even subfolders and import all those files in one fell swoop, as opposed to selecting them individually. Now, following on from the idea of importing and perhaps even doing some configuration of your data is the idea of saving this. And this is an extremely important component of Global Mapper, and it's also extremely important for new users to understand how Global Mapper interacts with data and how the process of managing files works. Essentially, what we do when we're finished with the import process or finished with some analysis workflow, what we'll do is save a workspace. A workspace saves essentially all loaded data and saves any configuration that's being applied to that data. So going back to where we left off our map, we'd imported a number of different layers. We have our boundary layer. I'm going to just turn on a couple of these. We'll turn on our parcels, and we'll turn on the original imagery that we had displayed. So let's say that we've reached the end of our workday, or perhaps we're going on to another project, and we want to save this configuration. We want to save this map as exactly as it looks right now. There is a very prominent save button right here in the toolbar that will do that for us. Control S is the keyboard shortcut. Save workspace. A workspace is provides a reference to any data that's loaded. So if I simply click save, I'm going to drop this right on my desktop for convenience. I'm going to call this one parcels and save. Next time I come into the office, next time I resume this project, I can simply load that workspace and it will automatically display all of these layers in this format with the colors that I've applied or any other configuration that has been set. The important thing about a workspace is it references the original file. In other words, I have loaded this parcels layer. It's a shapefile. We dragged and dropped it from my Windows Explorer window, and it's now loaded obviously in Global Mapper. By saving the workspace, Global Mapper has retained that path. If that path is broken for whatever reason, if I delete the shapefile, or if I move it to a new folder, or perhaps if it's on a network location that's no longer accessible, maybe I've moved to a different location, maybe I'm in the field, that workspace will not work. It retains that file. So while the workspace is able to display all this data, it does not actually contain the data. The data is in its original format. Now, further to that, if I make any changes to this layer, if using my digitizer I decide to delete some of these parcels, or if I modify some of the attributes, that will not be reflected in the original layer. That will only be recorded within the workspace. If my workflow required me to save those in its original format, it would necessitate an export to apply that. So important consideration: while Global Mapper reads files, references files, allows you to configure files, it does not natively change the structure of the files you import. That has to be, if you need to do that, it has to be applied through an export process. So we've saved a workspace. Just to confirm what I'm going to do for you, remember the keyboard shortcut I introduced very briefly earlier. Control U is my onload. Try that one more time. There we go. Well, my data is now gone, and I have a dedicated load workspace option. It should remember the last place I saved my workspace to. It's a proprietary file, GMW file. I'll click open, and hopefully when it completes it will show exactly as I left. All of the files that I referenced previously are loaded, as is the visual characteristics have been retained as well. So workspaces are very important in terms of data management. The important thing in working with workspaces is you're not loading maps, but you're loading references to where those maps reside, perhaps on your local hard drive or perhaps on a network location. One of the more commonly used functions in Global Mapper is the digitizer, of which there are countless flavors and various ways that you can interact with vector features. Is essentially what this tool, the function of this tool performs. We'll begin the process today very simply by using some of the drawing tools. How can we draw polygons or lines? You can also use it for interacting or modifying or editing existing vector features. For instance, the parcels that we were just working with. We could select a parcel and make geometric changes to it, move it, rotate it, or whatever, or delete it even. That's a very common use as well. So it is a very, very powerful tool. We're obviously only going to scrape the proverbial tip of the iceberg as far as that function is concerned, but it is something I do encourage you, if you're using Global Mapper, new user, spend some time playing with some of the digitizing tools and seeing what functions are available. And again, we have reference materials, we have recorded presentations where we've gone into a little more depth as far as those digitizer functions are concerned. So we're just going to pick up where we left off. We've still got this map displayed. I'm going to introduce initially the digitizer tool itself. It looks like a pencil here, right where my cursor is located in the toolbar. If we select that tool, no longer am I in zoom mode. No longer can I drag to zoom on the map like I did previously. I still have access to the mouse wheel, so I still can zoom in and zoom out, but we're now in digitizer mode, and you will have noticed that in its native and original format it says edit. It is an editing tool. It's waiting for me to select something, and I'm just going to choose a parcel at random. Oh, sorry, I've got my boundary. Let me turn that one off so we can isolate just one of the parcels, and you can see now I've selected one of those parcels. I'm going to quickly introduce the right-click menu. Do not be intimidated by this. I know it's a little overwhelming for new users, but if I, for instance, wanted to move this or reshape it, I can access an entire suite of editing functions that will apply to what I've just selected. Rotating, scale. I can simplify or smooth the geometry of that. So multiple options for changing that. And that's based on the fact that I've selected something on the map and I've selected my digitizer in its edit mode. For those of you who are interested in actually creating features, you can go straight to some of these digitizer tools, and they're fairly intuitive. The button graphics fairly clearly display exactly what each does. So if I, for instance, wanted to create a new area, I can simply select that tool, and where previously it said edit, now it says area. I'm just simply going to left click couple of times here to draw something on my map, and when I have completed that, or when I'm about to put the final shape point or final vertex, I right click, and by right clicking it triggers this modify feature info dialog box that lets me assign this to a layer, to assign it to a feature type, which we talked about earlier, to add attributes if they're necessary, or to define the visual characteristics of this feature if that's appropriate. I'm just going to go with the defaults and click OK. And you'll see now I've created an object on the map and assigned it to a layer. The layer I've created, by the way, is called user created features. As you can see, turn it on and turn it off. So I could have placed this in my parcels layer or any of the existing layers, or I could have created a brand new layer myself that I would have named. But that is the basic process of using the digitizer. The digitizing tools have been broken up since older versions of Global Mapper. We now have what we would consider to be the more common digitizing tools for creating points, lines of various types, and areas or polygons of various types. There is also a collection of what we would consider more advanced digitizing tools. I'm not going to go into these in any detail today, but things like Kogo or coordinate geometry input, generating range rings, generating buffers. We also have a number of tools that perform edits to existing features or selected features. Again, transforming points into polygons or polygons into points or whatever. Buffering is another option here. So most of the legwork that you're going to do with the digitizer is going to be within this menu, the idea of creating points, lines, polygons. And regardless of this geometric structure, whether it be points, whether it be lines, whether it be polygons, you're going to get basically the same dialog box after you complete the creation of one of those features that allows you to confirm exactly which layer and the structure or the characteristics or classification of that particular feature. So the final step in any workflow is exporting data, and as we indicated earlier, talking about our bookends, first end of the bookshelf being importing, last end being exporting. It is an important part of most workflows, being able to get data out. We're not talking simply about exporting files, but also performing things like a PDF generation or even printing. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those options, the idea of being able to share data not only through file formats, but through hard copy printing or PDF generation. So right back where we were again. Intention here is perhaps to work with our original data. I used the digitizer to create this individual polygon. It gives me an opportunity to show how we can remove a layer from the display. The polygon was actually assigned to this user created features layer. I can use either delete key on my keyboard or right click and close this layer just simply by choosing this menu item. Because there's something actually digitized here, it's asking me to save the workspace. I don't want to save this. This was just a quick demonstration, so I'm going to say no in this case. That layer is now gone. The feature is gone. It's not assigned to an external file. I didn't actually export that at all, so the digitizing work that I did is completely gone. So for demonstrating exporting, what I'm going to do first is redraw my map to its full extent. And we have a button here in the toolbar, our full view button, a little house, I guess. The home button on your keyboard will also work. It takes us out to our full extent. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the export options. One thing to note before we do is if you have multiple files of a particular type loaded, I've only got one polygon layer here, for instance, but if I had multiple layers of the same type and I initiated an export, the export would by default join them together into a single layer. We're often asked how that process works, and how do I take multiple shapefiles, convert them into a single shapefile? Well, there's no action required. That is the default behavior of Global Mapper. Global Mapper will export all of the data that you have loaded on the screen, and there are various settings can be applied, but by default it will load all of those data files by default. Perhaps most useful for imagery. If you've got multiple tiles of imagery and your objective is to create a single mosaiced file, you can simply run an export with all those files loaded, and it will mosaic them together by default. If you need to be more selective on what's exported, well, a couple of ways you can do that. You can use the overlay control center to uncheck what you do not need. Essentially, what's displayed on the screen will be all that's exported. So if I did not want to export imagery, perhaps add another tile of imagery here or some other raster data, by simply unchecking that layer, it will not be exported. If it's not displayed, it will not be exported. The other thing that we can do here is select a particular layer on the screen. So let's say, for instance, perhaps I have multiple vector files, but I only want to export this parcels layer. Simply right-click on it, and we have the option here to export. From the layer menu at the bottom, just export that layer to a new file. So that's a more selective process where we know exactly what's going to be exported. So I'll just take a look at just some examples here. We'll take the parcels there again, because it's the only one that's on my screen. I can just either right-click as I did before, but I can go straight to the File menu and introduce the Export submenu. You'll see that unlike with the import process, where it's a very streamlined procedure where a single dialog box essentially allows us to import virtually any different data type, when we're exporting data, we need to be more specific on the type of data and indeed where it's going to be exported to. You'll see there's a number of options here. All the way at the bottom, you'll notice we have the option to export to a spatial database. If I was working with ArcSDE or Oracle Spatial or any of those standard spatial databases, I could export directly to a spatial database. I can also import, by the way, from a spatial database, one thing we did not acknowledge earlier. So you can read and write to your spatial databases. Now, that obviously needs to be specified during that export process. But within the file generation process, we can also specify whether we're exporting elevation grid format data, raster data, or vector data. And we've also included LiDAR in that subset as well. So in my case, I want to export this shapefile. So I'm going to choose the vector LiDAR format. And this will give me a subset of the supported formats that are specifically vector in format. So if my intention is to generate, for instance, a CAD file, I can go straight to DXF, and this originated as a shapefile. I'm simply running a process to export it as a DXF. We'll click OK. Now, there are a number of recurring options that you will find with the export process. One is tiling, where you can specify an array of tiles rather than a single file. Again, most applicable and most common when using imagery. Or we can define the export bounds. So if we only want to export what's on our screen, or what we manually draw as a box. If I choose this option, I can quite literally draw a box and say I only want to export what's in this area. Or we can define the export based on a selected area or polygon. I don't have anything active, so this is grayed out right now. But this allows me to export just the data within a geographic extent, if that's applicable. In our case, we'll export everything, so we don't need to worry about the export bounds, nor do we need to worry about tiling. Because we're generating a DXF, there are going to be settings that are particular to this format, as there will for every format that you select. Raster exports will obviously be unique in some of the settings that they would apply. This being a DXF, I've got options in here. I'm not going to go into the details. We click OK. We define the target. I'm going to again put it on my desktop. I'll just call it test. And we run that export. We hit a save button, and it has exported that DXF for me. So the process of getting data out of Global Mapper, while it does require you to select some more specifics in terms of the format and obviously defining a target, is still very, very intuitive. So file export, I'm not going to demonstrate the raster process, export process or imagery. Same procedure, choosing the appropriate format. Another thing to mention about for sharing, this is a very, very simple procedure. We can simply grab a screen capture of the current map display. Very often this is useful if someone simply asks you to see the map that you're working on right now. They don't need to export files. They don't need to work with shape files or CAD files. They just want to see your map. Shift-C is the keyboard shortcut here. Capture screen contents to image will take your current map display and simply create an image file. You can choose the format JPEG, PNG, bitmap file. Just simply generate that file and you can attach it to an email, send it to a client or a colleague, whatever you need to do. So in many ways, that's the simplest way to export your data, is simply capturing the screen. We have some folks who share data in the form of workspace files. And if you recall back to the last section, we talked about saving a workspace. That workspace, which is currently sitting right on my desktop, is a file. I could theoretically send that to another user. However, knowing what we know about workspaces, that they retain the path to the file, if that file is on my hard drive and I choose to send the workspace to a third party, that third party will not see the file because, again, it's on my workspace. Now, the solutions to that are perhaps to send the files as well. That becomes a little convoluted. Or maybe if it's a shared data location, perhaps you're working off a common network and the directory path is the same for everyone. Sharing the workspace will allow you in that context to read the files from the same location. Those are exceptions to the normal rule. Workspaces, generally speaking, are not intended for sharing. That's not what they were designed for. They're designed for you as a local user to save your configuration, to save your map display. So I normally say as a rule, do not share workspaces based on the possible exceptions I just noted. So the logical question that comes up after I introduce this idea of workspaces not being shareable is, what would I use to share data? What's the best method for me to share my map display with a global mapper user who has access to the files but does not have access to the directory path? Well, we've developed a format specifically for that purpose. I'll just turn on another layer here just to illustrate this. So let's say, for instance, I want to export what I see on my screen right now, the directory structure, the visual characteristics, the extent, etc. The way that I would do that is through creating what's called a global mapper package file. And if I go all the way to the export submenu once again, you will notice the very first item here says global mapper package file. I'm not going to do this right now, but if I did create a package file, what I would do is essentially create a compressed file with all of the data that I have currently loaded into my workspace, raster, vector, or even any linked files. If you've actually created hyperlinks to external files, those would also be embedded in there. That could then be transferred as a single file to another global mapper user, and when that global mapper user imports that into the application, it essentially recreates the exact workspace structure that you had displayed when you created that file. So it's a way to share the maps that you've created very quickly and very efficiently with other global mapper users. Again, I'm not going to demonstrate that, but if you want a recommendation for sharing data among global mapper users, that's certainly the way to do it. We could export a shapefile and send a shapefile to another global mapper user, but that's going to remove any of the characteristics, any of the display characteristics, or any of the customization that I would have applied internally within my version of the software. Another very powerful option for sharing the map data, aside from simply generating files, is to generate a PDF. And there is a dedicated option here in the export submenu to export a PDF file. When you're generating a PDF, it's in many ways comparable to actually sending a file to a printer. With the PDF files that you generate in Global Mapper, the geospatial intelligence of the data is retained in the file. They become essentially geospatial PDFs. And if you load one of those PDFs up in, for instance, the standard version of Adobe Acrobat Reader, you can initiate a process whereby you can measure geographically. Ground units will be retained, coordinate values will be retained in that file, and you can do a little bit of interaction with that data. Even for folks who are not familiar with GIS software, they can load this file up that you generate into the Acrobat Reader and interact with the data in its geographic context. It will also allow you to turn layers on and layers off. So it becomes almost like a little GIS viewer. Again, very applicable for folks who need access to the data but do not have access to GIS software. Again, in interest of time, I'm not going to show that, but something that's well worth taking a look at yourself. Now, the final sharing mechanism that I want to introduce is the idea of generating a printed map. We have for many years assumed that map printing is going to go the way of the dodo, so to speak. It's going to become extinct, but that's actually not the case. We're finding a lot of our users still consider the map print process to be a very important part of their workflow, and certainly a very efficient way of sharing data. So to that end, what we've done recently in Global Mapper is completely redesigned our print layout process. In the toolbar where my cursor is located is our print layout editor. I'm just going to introduce this very quickly. We can define a print layout by first of all defining a target paper size if that's applicable, the bounding coordinates of what we want to export, or the scale. We can do 2 of these but not 3. Obviously if I choose the paper size and bounds, the scale is going to happen automatically. So I'm just going to use these 2 just as an illustration. I'm actually going to simply click OK, and we'll take a quick snapshot of the map view. Now what we're looking at here is a depiction of what that printed map will look like in the context of the paper size that I selected. So you can see the rulers along the top. I'm using the standard US measured 8.5 by 11 sheet here, and you can see what that map will look like in that context. In this framework, we can add additional elements to the layout display. I'm very quickly going to show you, for instance, adding a title here, a text element. I'll call it parcels. Obviously, if you're doing this in the real world, you'll be a little more explicit. We can change the font. I'm going to make this a little bit larger than the default, which is 12. We'll make it a 22 point Verdana bold title. And we can choose whether we want a frame, in other words, a box around the edge. I'm going to say no in this case. I'm going to click OK. And you can see now that label has been applied. I can physically drag it to a new location, move it around. I can change the properties if I need to, change the font size, etc. But what I'm seeing here is a preview of exactly how this map will appear when I print it out, when I hit the print button, when I'm finally done. We could put a scale bar, north arrow, we could put a legend if it was applicable. We could put tick marks around the edge of our map to indicate lat long, or a local coordinate system if that's appropriate for our map display. When we're done with that, from the file menu, you can just go to the print, and again, generating a printed map, completely interoperable. We're talking about a format here which anybody can use, and that doesn't require any software, obviously. So this is, when we talk about sharing map data, very often this is the most efficient way to get your maps into a format that other people can work with. You'll notice also here we also have the option to export a PDF from this dialog box as well. A geospatial PDF can be generated based on this customized layout that you've created. So a very quick introduction. All of these themes, by the way, including what we've just showed you here very briefly, this layout, we have introduced in much more detail in some of our other presentations. So as a new user, if any of the functions that we've introduced are of interest to you, or you find them useful or relevant in your workflow, feel free to visit our YouTube channel or go to our website, and you'll find much more information. We go into a lot more detail. So that completes a very basic introduction to Global Mapper. Hopefully, for those of you who have never seen it before, giving you some indication as to where to access some of those key functions. And obviously, we scraped the tip of the iceberg, as I mentioned earlier. Didn't go into a lot of detail. Hopefully, based on what I showed you, you can at least get started with the software, loading some data, changing some of those settings, and perhaps exporting data as well. As I promised at the start, if you have any questions, you can email our tech staff directly, geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. I'll put a link in the description right below if you're looking at this on YouTube. If you have questions about sales, some of our licensing options, I did briefly introduce how you register Global Mapper. If you need more detail on for instance, network licensing, contact the folks at our sales department, orders@bluemarblegeo.com, and they'll be more than happy to help you with that. And if you're not currently using Global Mapper, I did show you at the start where you can access the software itself. There's the URL. I will again put a link to this one in the description below, so you should be able to go directly to our website, download the software. When you get to that registration screen, you can simply request a trial. Software will be active for a couple of weeks, and you can try it out, and then obviously purchase a license if it's appropriate for you. Thank you for taking the time to view this recorded webcast, and we will see you again next month.